Good morning, all. Thank you for joining us this morning. This is class number 10. If you have your lesson material, Zechariah 9 through 11 will be the text that we'll talk about this morning. But I'd like to start in 1 Peter chapter 1. It seems like a far cry from Zechariah. We've referenced this passage a couple of times. I thought it might be good to go ahead and especially read it in light of what we're going to talk about this morning. So before we begin there, Colton, would you mind to start us with a word of prayer?
Let's pray. Heavenly Father in heaven, thank you for this wonderful day you've given us to come together with Christians alike today, Father. We realize now more than ever that this truly is a blessing to be able to worship together without fear of persecution. We ask, Father, that you be with our brothers and sisters who are overseas, who don't get this luxury, that you keep them strong in the faith, and that you keep encouraging them. Father, as we dive into the Word, we ask that you help us clear our minds. We realize many things in this life can distract us from the things that truly matter. And we ask that you help us really focus on the message of what Michael's about to present, and that we adhere to it and try to apply it to our lives. Please give him guidance as he presents what he's prepared and present it in a way that's not only truthful, but also in a way that's understandable and applicable to our lives. It's your son's name that we pray.
Amen. Thank you. So we've referenced, or I think in passing, this passage a couple of times, but I thought it might be good to start this morning. Did Zechariah understand the things that he was writing? It's a little bit of a tricky question when you're talking about somebody as an inspired writer. But I think Peter gives us a clue in general about the prophets, is that it's completely unreasonable to expect the people of that day, including Zechariah himself, to fully understand all these things that he was writing. The clarity of this didn't come about till centuries later. So read with me 1 Peter chapter 1. Let's start in verse 8. It kind of builds into this conversation. The meat of what we're going to talk about is in verses 10 through 12. But let's start in verse 8. Talking about Christ, and again, Peter, remember, writing to Christians, though you have not seen him, you love him. Though you do not see him now, you believe in him and rejoice with joy inexpressible and filled with glory, obtaining the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls. So he takes that comment about salvation and then goes on this little tangent. Concerning this salvation, the prophets who prophesied about the grace that was to be yours searched and inquired carefully, inquiring what person or time the Spirit of Christ in them was indicating when he predicted the sufferings of Christ and his subsequent glories. It was revealed to them that they were not serving themselves, but you, in the things that have now been announced to you through those who preach the good news by the Holy Spirit, sent from heaven, things into which angels long to look into. So, I didn't give you a lot of preparation time on that verse. Well, if you notice in verse 11, the prophets desired to understand. They inquired, what's this person like? When's the time going to be? How do all these things fit together? They inquired what person or time that the Spirit was indicating when he predicted all these things. In verse 12, it was revealed to them that they were not serving themselves, but you. Zechariah wasn't writing so he could understand it. He was writing so that I could, and that you could. That's pretty cool. So you think about all these men that lived at the time of Zechariah, his contemporaries. The things that we're going to read this morning from chapters 9 through 11 had to be extremely challenging for them to understand and piece together. Now, with the benefit of 2,500 years of human history, and knowing what we know about the Gospels, we can piece some of these things together. Some of them are a little bit obscure, but we can still piece some of them together. Important to remember, this had to be wild to Zechariah and to all his contemporaries. How God worked through prophecy in that way, just thought that was probably a good place to start as we turn back to Zechariah chapter 9. Because Zechariah chapters 9 through 14, these last 6 chapters we're going to talk about today and Wednesday, are some of the most prophetic, messianic, kingdom prophecies that you're going to find anywhere in the Old Testament. Just one right after another. And it is challenging because Zechariah doesn't move chronologically. He doesn't move in any kind of linear way. He'll talk about the end of the world, and then he'll talk about Jesus, and then he'll talk about, seems like talking about maybe the destruction of Jerusalem, and he bounces around to different time frames, and it's challenging. And it would have been extremely challenging, again, for his contemporaries and for him. But I believe if we handle this correctly, we, again, 2,500 years of history to benefit us, we can make sense of some of these prophecies. So I think if you had an opportunity to look through these chapters, I guess give me your perspective. What did you note about chapters 9 through 11? Do they seem like they're similar to where we've been so far? Are they very different? What's your impression of these chapters we're going to talk about this morning?
Similar in that Zechariah was the encourager.
Yes.
I see encouragement.
Zechariah is very encouraging. He seems like he's got an optimistic spirit. He's very encouraging. So Carol says she sees that thread for sure. Anything else?
As you said earlier, it's more Messianic than what we've seen so far.
Yeah, the first 8 chapters still had some very practical information about the rebuilding of the temple and for Zechariah's contemporaries in that day. I think you'll see that the tone changes a bit as we get to chapters 9 through 11. So let's kind of begin. Hopefully you've had a chance to read this. Obviously in these classes we don't have time to read the text, but we'll make some observations. So we begin in chapter 9, and again 9 through 14 we don't know exactly when these prophecies occurred. So we're kind of left to guess a little bit. Was it after the temple was completed? Was it during construction? Just very unsure. But we know that all these came from the Lord through Zechariah. So there's judgment that is pronounced on several different areas. God's holy judgment is pronounced in verses 1 through 8. What are some of the places that get judgment pronounced on them? Tyre is one, yeah. Damascus, Sidon, Ashkelon, Gaza. So there's a number of, and there's a list for you. Damascus, yeah. Ekron, Ashdod. Depending on your version, some say Hadrach and some say Hamath and some say both. So where are these places? This is really hard. I know maps are really hard to see. I did extraordinarily poor on that one. If we were to map out these places, this takes you somewhat in an orderly way, going north to south down the Mediterranean coast, if you map these things out. So again, he starts in verse 1 with Damascus, which would be up in Syria, and then he comes down the coast, Tyre and Sidon, and then down to Gaza and Ashdod and Ashkelon, which are down further down the Mediterranean coast. And he kind of makes this progression from north to south as he's pronouncing these judgments. Okay? But that's where the location of all of these cities or areas, some are specific cities, some are kind of regions that looks like they're going to have a pretty bad time. Yes, sir.
He seems, from verse 6, I recall back in King Saul's day, all of these places were Philistine
Yes.
temples.
Yes.
And he mentions the pride of the Philistines.
Yes. Interesting, this is the last place in the Bible that we kind of read that term, Philistine or Philistia. But these are still lands we would call lands of the Philistines. And by the way, if you've heard the name Palestine, that's just a derivative of that term for Philistine. So these are, especially when you get down, now Damascus and Tyre would have been kind of different areas, but especially when you get down to Ashkelon, Gaza, Ekron, Ashdod, those are Philistine cities. Tyre and Sidon a little farther north. Yes, Lebanon or Phoenicia, depending on which time in history you're looking at. Damascus is in Syria, and it's still in Syria. You can still go visit that area.
Mark, we still talk about the Gaza Strip a lot, so that's that area.
Yes.
Talk about there. Still,
And a lot
still a big problem.
of, yeah, still Yeah. I don't know if I'm prepared for that this morning. So, in all of this, there's also noted in these first 9 verses, there is an area that is spared from all this. It looks like this destruction is just going to come north to south and rain terror on this whole area, but somewhere specifically is spared. What's that note? Jerusalem. How'd you get there? Where's that noted?
I got it from Jebusite, verse 7.
Ekron shall be like the Jebusites. Verse 8, I will encamp. Remember God talking, verse 8. I will encamp at my house as a guard, so that none shall march to and fro. I will encamp at my house as a guard, and none will march to and fro. No oppressor will march over them, and I will see with my own eyes. So I believe the answer is Jerusalem, but I believe it's from verse 8. That who is spared, God says, my house. They are. Jebusites are in Jerusalem. Ekron will be like the Jebusites. I don't really know what that means. That's what I believe that means, yes. Yeah. So Jebusites kind of got merged in. It also speaks earlier about, in verse 7, that some of these nations of the Philistines will become a remnant for our God and will be like a clan in Judah, and Ekron will be like the Jebusites. Do we know anywhere in Bible history where any of these cities that used to be Philistine cities were merged into God's people? There is example of that. Acts chapter 8 and verse 40, Philip went and preached to some of these cities when the gospel, preached the gospel in Azotus, which is Ashdod. So I think there's definitely kingdom prophecy here in that some of these cities would be, in verse 7, a remnant for our God. They weren't going to be completely annihilated. Some were going to be later merged into the kingdom. They will be like a clan that's merged into Judah. They will be like the Jebusites, which were kind of folded into Jerusalem. But I will encamp at my house. I will encamp at my house as a guard. God's going to protect Jerusalem. So if I could give the 30,000-foot view of these verses, destruction is going to just rain from north to south and wipe out, it seems like, almost everything in its path. There's going to be some remnant that's spared, but I'm going to stay at my house as a guard. Okay, now, extra credit. The extra credit question. Do we have any idea when this was fulfilled? 330. I got to vote for 330. I'll amen that. What happened?
Well, he marched around and took all those places, but he spared Jerusalem.
He did. And so if you're able to find, in this is secular history, Alexander the Great, in the beginning of his campaign, he believes he's going to take over the world. He wants to conquer the Persian kingdom. He begins in kind of this area, starts kind of in Greece, and literally almost takes this path that Zechariah, in this order. He works his way from Damascus to Tyre and Sidon and down the coast to the cities of the Philistines and wipes them out one at a time. This is established secular history. And that happened in 330. So remember where we are here in our timeline. We're, 520, 515? And so almost 200 years later, exactly what Zechariah prophesied happened here. Extra credit. Double extra bonus points. How was Jerusalem spared? Does anybody know that story? That's a wild story. Miss Carol?
There's no biblical.
Yes, correct.
Well,
This is Josephus. Take it with an enormous grain of salt. Yeah.
God sent to Alexander the Great.
Yes.
A vision to Alexander the Great.
Yes.
And he would see these priests.
Yes.
And the people of Israel coming out to meet him, and they opened their gates when he came. And he went up there by himself, and he went to the temple and offered sacrifices. And his second in command asked him, "Why you spared these?" And he said, "Because their God showed me what I needed to do."
That is exactly right. Very good. Very good memory. So, again, Did it happen is a great question. Here's what we know for sure is even though Alexander the Great just cleaned house all the way down the coast and did annihilate these cities, and you can read the Siege of Tyre. It's a very famous, it's a great story. It's a very famous battle, how Alexander the Great took Tyre, took Sidon, took Damascus, took Gaza, took all of these towns, but he just walked by Jerusalem, which is somewhat odd. Historians have a difficult time with that. The Josephus story, and again, Josephus is sometimes a little fast and loose with the facts, likes to set things up in a Jewish whatever. You kind of got to take it with a grain of salt. But Josephus' story is that the high priest at the time saw Alexander coming, said, "We are toast, we have no hope, let's have everybody just put on their finest linen white garments. We'll open the gates to the city and walk out to him and beg for forgiveness," essentially. Alexander the Great, who at this point has shown no mercy to anyone, walks up to this crowd and bows before them. And everyone is blown away. And he said, "Why are you treating these Jews with such respect?" And he said, "I had a dream that these men were going to walk out of this city in white clothes, and now this dream has come true. God's trying to tell me something." That's Josephus' story. Did that happen? Who knows? For some reason, Alexander did not destroy Jerusalem. What is noted here in verse 8, "I will encamp in my house as a guard," in 330 did happen. Now, that wasn't forever. We know what happens to Jerusalem later in history. But at that time, Jerusalem was spared, even though everyone around it was destroyed. It's an interesting story. I don't know if it's a true story. But whatever happened, Jerusalem was spared because everything else was conquered in Palestine 330 BC, but Jerusalem is spared. So if you believe all that story, there probably is some kernel of truth in there. It might be exaggerated and embellished a little bit, but for whatever reason, the Jews earned some favor with Alexander the Great. You can find that from history. They were allowed to keep the religion. Even Jews in other parts of the country were spared when he destroyed other parts of the world. So they earned favor somehow. If it was Josephus' story, it's hard to know.
Michael, you can see God's prophecy in the story of how he took Tyre.
Yes.
And others had tried and not succeeded, and that he didn't even try Jerusalem.
Yes. Okay, so you talked me into that. You baited me into talking about Tyre. I wasn't going to do that this morning, but Miss Carol baited me. So if you look at verse 3 of chapter 9, Tyre has been kind of this impenetrable city for centuries. Centuries. That none of the conquering nations have been able to take Tyre. Tyre is well fortified, and it's an island off the coast a little bit. And so obviously it's very difficult to get your troops to the island to conquer it. And even though there'd been siege, Nebuchadnezzar tried, the other nations before Nebuchadnezzar tried, nobody had ever able to conquer Tyre. There's a great prophecy in Ezekiel about Tyre, but we'll spare you that. But verse 3 says, "Tyre has built herself a rampart, heaped up silver like dust, fine gold like the mud of the streets. But behold, the Lord will strip her of her possessions and strike down her power on the sea, and she'll be devoured by fire." That building a rampart and especially the stripping of her possessions, is pretty interesting. So here's what happened. When Alexander the Great came to Tyre, they told him he couldn't take it. He took that as a challenge. That's kind of the kind of guy he was. He destroyed what city was there on the mainland, took the rubble from all of those buildings. Maybe you've heard this story. Took all the rubble from all these nations that he demolished and literally built a causeway in the sea, dumped all of that rubble into the sea until he built a causeway that was long enough to get to the island of Tyre. Who knows how many men and how many tons of rubble it took dumped into the sea to build this causeway where his army could literally walk out to Tyre, which was an island. But when it says that Tyre was stripped of her possessions, the coastland part of that is literally true. It was stripped bare, and every bit of construction material was dumped into the ocean. Ezekiel's got a great prophecy about that also, that Tyre will be stripped bare. But that you can find that's one of the great military engineering victories in history is Alexander the Great taking Tyre. Miss Carol baited me into that. I wasn't going to do that 5 minutes, but she baited me into that. But Tyre's a great story. So we got all this prophecy fulfilled in 330, about 200 years after Zechariah. Again, what would the contemporaries have understood about this? Just that judgment was coming on some of these cities, and that God was going to protect his house in verse 8. Okay, let's move on to verses 9 through 17. Verses 9 through 17, in my judgment, turned pretty messianic. And I asked the question, where are these things fulfilled? I think you got to pick and choose a little bit. You can see where they're fulfilled in different places. So there's certainly some that are pretty easy to identify and some that may be a little more challenging. What did you find in there that we can pretty easily identify where it's fulfilled? So the verse 9 for sure, the humble king coming on a donkey, we're all on board with that one. In fact, Matthew references this passage, that the fact that their king would be humble, mounted on a donkey, on the colt, the foal of a donkey, that is very clearly pointing to Matthew chapter 21. So that for sure is messianic. Again, just imagine how that would have sounded to Zechariah and his contemporaries. He's just been talking about how his house was going to be spared, and it sounds like there's going to be this conquering king, and then we get to your king's going to be riding in on a donkey. Just very bizarre. How's this all pieced together? Anything else from those verses that you see in prophecy? Well, verse 11, there's probably a phrase that we actually use from time to time, or would probably be familiar to you in verse 11. As for you also, because the blood of my covenant with you, I will set your prisoners free from the waterless pit. Where do we hear language like that? Blood of that covenant. Hebrews is one place, yep. Matthew 26:28, Jesus used very similar language when he was talking about the Lord's Supper. Blood of that covenant. I forget exactly how that reads. It's not a direct quoting of this passage, but you wonder if he had it in mind. Let's look at that real quick. Matthew 26:28. And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, drink of it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. We've read that verse. You've heard that read during the Lord's Supper many times. So because of the blood of the covenant, I will set your prisoners free from the pit. Any thoughts about that? How's the blood of the covenant set prisoners free? Yeah. Forgiveness, absolutely. Prisoners of sin, prisoners, slaves to sin, because of the blood of the covenant, they're free. So you can see that in verse 11. As also for you, because of the blood of my covenant, I will set your prisoners free. Verse 10 kind of notes that this kingdom, this king that's coming on the donkey, he's going to come without weapons. I will cut off the chariot and the war horse and the battle bow. This is not going to be a kingdom with weapons, even though that it's going to rule from sea to sea. There is some fulfillment in that. We see 2 Corinthians 10:4. You could go to other places also. The weapons of our warfare aren't carnal. That kind of language. So just a couple more from this section. Again, in verse 11, the setting the prisoners free, and then verse 13. I have bent Judah as my bow. I have made Ephraim my arrow. I will stir up your sons, O Zion, against your sons, O Greece, and wield you like a warrior's sword. There's a couple things about that verse that are really, really interesting. First of all, does anybody have any thoughts about that? Anybody do any study about that one, what that might mean? The first thing that is kind of at least interesting to note here is that at the time of Zechariah's writing, Greece is a nothing. I mean, Greece is not it's a backwater. It's certainly not an empire. And so the fact that anybody would have any need to fight against Greece is bizarre. Like, this is prophesying that Greece was going to be an empire a couple hundred years before it actually happened. This is kind of another one of these instances. We see where the Lord, or God through his prophets prophesied about Cyrus coming. He prophesied about the Persians taking out the Babylonians. Here he's prophesying about the Greeks coming. This was way before anybody was ever worried about the Greeks. Alexander the Great, the empire of Greece, is 200 years away. But here he makes the point, I'm going to stir up your sons, O Zion, against your sons, O Greece. You can find plenty of critical scholars who will say this had to be added later. Nobody even knew what the Greeks were. We kind of know why God knew, right? Where did the sons of Zion fight against the sons of Greece? That's a little bit more difficult. We could pick out some places, the Maccabees or something like that, where they fought and rebelled against the Greek leaders. Don't want to get too far down that path, but just the fact that he references Greece in verse 13 is pretty interesting. And then verses 14 through 17 is very kind of prophetic language, very, what's the word I'm looking for? It's not literal, it's figurative language. Very figurative language about the victory. He's just talked about there's not going to be physical weapons, but then he goes into this very figurative language about all the weapons that was going to be used. Again, Zechariah had to just be scratching his head through this whole thing. What am I writing? This is wild. You can just imagine writing and not understanding what you're writing. It just has to be such a strange, surreal experience to be writing this and not be able to make heads or tails of it. It just has to be so bizarre. The Lord will appear over them, and his arrow will go forth like lightning. The Lord God will sound the trumpet and will march forth in the whirlwind. The Lord of hosts will protect them, and they shall devour and tread down the sling stones, and shall drink and roar as if drunk with wine. It's going to be exciting. Not going to literally be drunk, but they're going to act as if they were drunk. They're being so excited. And be full like a bowl and drench the corners of the altar. On that day, the Lord their God will save them as a flock of his people for the jewels of his crown, and will shine in the land. How great is his goodness, how great is his beauty. See that kingdom prophecy, especially verse 16, the Lord God will save them as a flock of his people for the jewels of his crown. That's pretty good stuff about what we are. A flock of his people, the jewels of his crown. Zechariah prophesies that. Okay, anything else about chapter 9? We got a little Zechariah fatigue, it sounds like. What about Zechariah chapter 10? So, again, I think the compiler here has done a pretty good job of dividing these into chapters, because the tone definitely changes from chapter 9 to chapter 10, and from chapter 10 to chapter 11 especially. Chapter 10 is very optimistic. We're back to Miss Carroll's optimism, encouragement. Zechariah is very encouraging in chapter 10. Anybody want to give me, from your study of chapter 10, kind of the overview? What's the overview of chapter 10? Yeah, it was very positive. Lots of blessings. You know, I asked the question, why would this be comforting to the Jews in Zechariah's time? Notice all the language that's used here. That there's going to be mighty men in battle in verse 5. That we're going to strengthen Judah in verse 6. That there's going to be mighty warriors in Ephraim in verse 7. As many as before in verse 8. That's pretty interesting language. Chapter 10, verse 8. I will whistle for them and gather them in, for I have redeemed them, and they shall be as many as they were before. Think about that, what that would have meant to a Jew in Zechariah's time. As many as there was before? Like, I know how many Israelites there were in the time of Solomon. There's going to be as many as there was then. We know how that has been misapplied by the Jews throughout the centuries. But that's pretty impressive prophecy. And all of those things, everything in chapter 10, I would argue, is really hard to understand unless it's understood spiritually. All this talk about the kingdom and the strengthening of Judah and the defeat of the conquering of God's armies and the mighty men in battle and trampling the foe and gathering the nations in. None of that makes any sense in secular history. It makes a ton of sense in spiritual history. We definitely see God doing that. We see God conquering his foes. We see God calling men in from all nations. We see, I just love the language in verse 8, God whistling for his people and gathering them in. And I think some versions render that differently. That's what the English Standard says in verse 8. He's going to whistle for them and they come in. That almost like a mom at supper time. That kind of, at least that's the visual I get. I'll whistle for them and gather them in, for I have redeemed them, and they shall be as many as there were before. Verse 9, even though I scattered them among the nations in far countries, they will remember me, and with their children they shall live and return. There's going to be this great return to Jerusalem. So, did that happen physically? It's hard to find evidence of that. Did it happen spiritually? Did it happen spiritually that God whistled and his people came to Jerusalem? Absolutely. Hold your place there. We'll go to prove that. Let's go to Hebrews chapter 12. Hebrews chapter 12. Somebody want to read verses 22 through 24?
But you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to myriads of angels, the general assembly and church of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, to the spirits of righteous men made perfect, Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood which speaks better than the blood of Abel.
Thank you. There's so much of what you read in Zechariah and in a lot of the minor prophets that doesn't make a lick of sense unless you comprehend that in a spiritual and a figurative way, God is calling all his believers to this spiritual Mount Zion, to spiritual Jerusalem. You have come. Remember, the writer of Hebrews is talking to Jews that are spread all over the world, but he says, you have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, to heavenly Jerusalem. Like that concept is so important to so much of Zechariah. God's belief that God's followers, people of God, have been called to come to spiritual Jerusalem, to spiritual Mount Zion. And so much confusion about when are these things going to happen to Israel? When are these things going to happen to Jerusalem? Is that confusion? They're happening now. We're all being called to Mount Zion. Hopefully we're right there in front of the angels in their festal gathering, as it says there in those verses, to the innumerable host. Like we're there. We're there this morning. And that's the only way I think you can make sense of this chapter. Any thoughts or questions, comments about that?
Michael, did you look at the statement there in verse 9 about
Yes. Yes.
When God was scattered his people among the people, his people would remember him.
Yes.
Acts 8:4 popped into my head.
Absolutely.
That, even though persecuted years later, people in spiritual Israel would not forget that. Basically, it's evangelistic.
Yes. So Roger notes in verse 9 that God says, I will scatter them. We see that happening a few times in Scripture. We see God scattering, in exile, the Jews to Babylon. But we see later, as he noted in Acts chapter 8, God scattering the early Christians in Jerusalem. Persecution scattered those early Christians. God has a point of scattering his people at times. To promote the evangelism and the spread of his word. God does scatter. He scattered them among the nations in far countries, and that promoted the spread of the gospel into all those areas. I think that's definitely kingdom prophecy in verse 9. And then this kind of triumphant conclusion to this chapter in verse 12, I will make them strong in the Lord They shall walk in his name. I mean, put that on our sign out front, right? I mean, how could that be more talking about the Lord's church, about the kingdom that's coming, about us? I'll make them strong in the Lord, and they will walk in his name. Hope that's us, right? I think you see that throughout chapter 10. A note on here, it definitely talks about a cornerstone in verse 4. There's messianic prophecies about the cornerstone and the tent peg. Those are both that kind of key peg that holds it all together. Definitely talking about Jesus there in verse 4, some messianic thoughts. Anything else about chapter 10?
At the first, he shot down the idols.
Yes. Yeah, begins the chapter, as Carol notes about shooting down idols, does that in verse 1 and 2, the household gods utter nonsense. Was that becoming a problem again for the people? Perhaps. Household gods utter nonsense, that's the English Standard Version. They tell false dreams, they give empty consolation, that's a great phrase. Empty consolation, and therefore the people wander like sheep afflicted for lack of a shepherd. Messianic also. Speaking of sheep and shepherds, I agree. We'll go to chapter 11, and chapter 11 is all about sheeps and shepherds. Sheeps? No, sheep and shepherds. All about sheep and shepherds. Again, very, very prophetic, very figurative. What's the easy call out in chapter 11? What's the most obvious piece of prophecy in chapter 11 that we see? Rejection of God's shepherd, for sure.
30 pieces of silver, 12.
30 pieces of silver for the potter is pretty, I don't know how, that is incredible detail for prophecy 500 years before the event. How can critics look at that and not see something phenomenal? 30 pieces of silver for the potter. We'll dive into that a little bit in just a moment. So the overview of chapter 11. The first couple of verses are somewhat difficult. Is it talking about Lebanon being destroyed, or is it talking about the cedars of Lebanon, like maybe the temple itself is going to be leveled at some future point? Hard to know. The thicket of Jordan is ruined. So verse 1 and 2, something is going to happen. Some destruction is coming in the first three verses. And then we get into verse 4, and Zechariah is asked to do what?
Feed the flock for slaughter.
Become a shepherd. And again, my version may read differently than yours, but verse 4, Zechariah is told to be a shepherd of the flock doomed to slaughter. A shepherd of the flock doomed to slaughter. So we've just got done with this incredibly optimistic, encouraging chapter in verse 10, and we launch into this, now you're going to be shepherd of the flock doomed to slaughter. Like the tone changes pretty dramatically in chapter 10. So there's this flock doomed to slaughter. And it may not come out and say this explicitly, but why is this flock doomed to slaughter? And I think, Roger, you said it earlier. Okay.
Entirely different.
Okay. Well, I'm definitely willing to be wrong.
Pasture the flock that was considered to be slaughtered by these other nations.
Okay.
You pasture, in other words, they're not going to be slaughtered.
Okay.
You pasture that they were doomed for slaughter by Babylon, the Medes, Persians. Because in verse 5 he says, those who buy them, slay them, and go and come.
Yes.
But he goes on to say that the ones who is trying to slaughter these people, that's who's going to be punished. But Zechariah, you pasture them.
Okay. No, that's it. So Roger and I saw this one differently, which is good, which is fine. You know, he said Zechariah was giving more of a protective, almost, view here, that they were doomed to slaughter, but they weren't going to be, that these who would have sold them and bought them in verse 5 will be protected. I'm perfectly willing to be wrong on that. My view of, or my look at this chapter, I guess, was more about, are the sheep doomed for slaughter the same as verse 6, the inhabitants of the land? That he said he would no longer have pity on them. And in verse 9, so I said, I will not be your shepherd. What is to die, let it die. What is to be destroyed, let it be destroyed. And let those who are left devour the flesh of one another. So is that when does that happen? You know, when does the shepherd say, my protection is no longer over you? Or is that talking about something else?
I understood that to be separating the remnant from those among God's people that
Yes.
are still going to be disobedient.
Yes.
It's the concept of sparing this remnant, which has been consistent.
Yes. Somebody. No. There's definitely a remnant kept, but somebody is being destroyed in verse 9. And with somebody in verse 10, there is a covenant that's being broken. So that might be a good conversation. I took my staff, and the name of this staff is wildly different if you look at different versions. Anybody got King James or New King James this morning? What's the name of that staff in verse 10? Pleasantness, beauty. English Standard is favor. I think you get the concept. Pleasantness, beauty, favor. And this staff he broke. So this figure of language about something. Verse 10, annulling the covenant I made with all the people. Any thoughts on that? Why would God break a covenant?
Is that people or peoples?
Okay.
Referring to the covenant that he had on earth, as far as what he would do, he was going to break that. Like I said, we're moving toward a new era.
Yes.
People don't know it. Obviously, the heathen nations, certainly no less than Zechariah.
Yes.
But is this message for them or for Zechariah and the people? That I'm breaking my covenant. I see it again as what was foretold that God was going to punish the nations that he had used to punish his people.
Yes.
But within his people, there's going to be a purging. Some are going to suffer, but there will be a remnant.
I think we're saying the same thing. Perhaps looking at some of the pieces differently, but I think you're exactly right. That there's going to be this remnant that's saved, but there is going to be this purging, in Roger's word, this purging that there's going to be many, even of the flock, that are destroyed because they're not following the shepherd. Again, I definitely think that's messianic. Do we know, were there those of the flock that were destroyed because they didn't follow the shepherd? Can we make a case for that of anything we read in the New Testament? Absolutely, we can make that case, right? Who were of the flock? Any Jews that didn't follow the shepherd who ultimately got destroyed? That for sure happened. History tells us that happened for sure. If that could be what we're talking about, for those that didn't follow the shepherd and were ultimately destroyed. And what happened to Jerusalem may play into here, I think, perhaps. Again, because they didn't follow the shepherd, they were ultimately destroyed. So, they go out. Let's look at verses 12, 13. I said, if it seems good to you, give me my wages, but if not, keep them. And they weighed out my wages as 30 pieces of silver. And the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter, the lordly price at which I was priced by them. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them in the house of the Lord to the potter. We spoke about this a moment ago, but and I think I've got the verse reference here. I don't have it. But if you look at Where is the verse? I think is it in Matthew where all this is, yeah, sorry, go ahead. Matthew 27, yes, where all this is in phenomenal detail. 30 pieces of silver was, I think the language is actually used in Matthew, was weighed out. Just like it says here in Zechariah, the 30 pieces of silver were weighed out. They were weighed out and given to Judas. And then that same 30 pieces of silver later came back and were given to who? Threw them in the floor of the temple, and the leaders of the temple, not willing to put it in the treasury, bought a potter's field with it. Think about that as it relates to this again. How awesome. 500 years before that event happened, we can trace those funds. We can trace that money to where it went. They weighed out my wages, 30 pieces of silver, and the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter, the lordly price I was priced. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the house of the Lord. Like Judah literally threw the money into the temple, Matthew 27, to the potter. Like what happened to those actual funds, the tracing of what happened to those 30 pieces of silver 500 years ahead of time happened precisely as noted in Zechariah. Weighed out, thrown in the temple, given to the potter. That detail on that is pretty phenomenal. End of chapter 11. Woe to the worthless shepherd who deserts the flock. May the sword strike his arm and his right eye. Let his arm be wholly withered and his eye utterly blinded. Some false shepherds were out there. Yeah. We will finish up Zechariah on Wednesday, chapters 12 through 14. And then we'll proceed on through the reconstruction of the temple. Thank you all.